Control Part 2. We're going to start at 29.9, the spinal cord. The spinal cord serves as a highway for information traveling to and from the brain and as the integrating center for reflexes that do not involve the brain. Remember, the spinal cord and the brain is part of the central nervous system, and many of the nerves that are found in both the spinal cord and the brain are interneurons. So the spinal cord is a portion of the central nervous system that connects the peripheral nervous system to the brain. Remember, the peripheral nervous system are the nerves that are the rest of the body. Spinal cord and the brain are enclosed in membranous meninges and cushioned by something called cerebrospinal fluid. Meninges, these are membranes that cover and protect your central nervous system, which includes your brain and your spinal cord. If you've ever heard of the disease meningitis, that is actually an inflammation of the meninges, which is not good because you don't want inflammation in your central nervous system. And cerebrospinal fluid is fluid that fills the spaces between the meninges and the central canal of the spinal cord and ventricles within the brain. So here you can see the brain and the spinal cord, and then you see the cerebrospinal fluid is the blue in this picture. The outer part of the spinal cord is called white matter. It's consisting of bundles of myelin sheath axons or tracts, and the tracts carry information from one part of the CNS to the other. So think of your white matter as kind of like the superhighway of information from your peripheral nervous system through your central nervous system. The gray matter makes up the bulk of your central nervous system, and it consists of cell bodies, dendrites, and many neuroglial cells. And you guys probably hear a lot people referring to your brain as gray matter. So white matter is tissue of the brain and spinal cord consisting of myelinated axons, and then gray matter is tissue in the brain and spinal cord that consists of cell bodies, dendrites, and neuroglial cells. Sometimes when you go to the doctor, they'll check for your reflexes. Reflexes are simple, ancient pathways of information flow through the body. Sensory signals flow to the spinal cord or the brainstem, which calls for response by way of motor neurons. So spinal reflexes involve peripheral nerves and the spinal cord. So a reflex is an autonomic response to stimulation that occurs without conscious thought or learning. So think about it. When you're sitting on the examining table, hits your knee with the little hammer and your foot automatically swings up, that is called a reflex pathway. You have no control over that reflex. So here's an example. Step 1, in this case, this individual accidentally sticks their hand with a nail, which is going to activate the sensory neuron to say, hey, pain, and that neuron is going to fire off into the inner neuron in your central nervous system here in the spinal cord. That information is going to get processed by the central nervous system, and those interneurons are then going to activate the motor neuron to tell you to immediately lift your hand up. So if you've ever stubbed your toe and you immediately lift your foot up, or if you've ever touched something hot and you immediately reflex away, that is part of the reflex pathway. You've probably heard a lot about spinal cord injuries before. Spinal cord injury is an injury that interrupts the tracts of the spinal cord and can cause loss of sensation and paralysis. Basically, what happens is you're stopping information from flowing along that information superhighway. Unlike axons of the peripheral nerves, spinal cord axons do not grow back. So if you have damage to the nerves in your spinal cord, they cannot be restored. And spinal injuries can cause permanent disability, and worldwide there are more than 2.5 million people that are disabled by a spinal cord injury. What's interesting is where you are injured in your spinal cord is going to determine where paralysis occurs. So for example, if you have an injury at the L1, then you'll probably be paralyzed from the legs down. However, higher up, you'll notice that paralysis increases. So if you have an injury closer to the brain in your cervical vertebrae, it's more likely that you are going to end up losing sensation throughout your body. I'm sure you all have heard of the disease multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease. What that means is your immune system attacks your spinal cord. So what happens is white blood cells in your blood start to attack and destroy nerve cells in the spinal cord and the brain. And so individuals start to get dizzy, numbness in hands and feet, muscle weakness, fatigue, and visual problems, and they eventually will become paralyzed. The other part of this lecture is all about the brain, and I do expect you guys to know key things about each part of the brain. So the brain is the main integrating organ in vertebrate nervous systems. And like we talked about at the very beginning of part one, vertebrates have something called cephalization, or a bundle of nerves in the head. In our case, our cephalization is the brain. In vertebrates, the embryonic neural tube develops into a spinal cord and the brain, which is your central nervous system. And during development, the brain is organized as three functional regions. You have the forebrain, which is shown here in the red, the midbrain, which is shown here in the yellow, and then the hindbrain, which is shown here in the blue and the green. So let's talk about the hindbrain. The hindbrain is continuous with the spinal cord. So you can see here in the pink, here's part of the brain, and it's also part of the spinal cord. And it's largely responsible for both your reflexes and your coordination. Fish and amphibians have the most pronounced midbrain. In birds and mammals, the midbrain is reduced. In birds and mammals, we have an extended forebrain that took over that were previously midbrain function. Okay, so we had already discussed this a little bit. The space in embryonic neural tubes develops into a system of cavities and canals filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And you guys remember that cerebral spinal fluid is that fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord. You also have something called the blood-brain barrier, and that controls the composition and concentration of cerebral spinal fluid. But what's really important about the blood-brain barrier is it's also going to prevent bacteria and viruses from getting into your brain and many substances. However, it's not perfect, and some toxins such as nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, and mercury can slip across this blood-brain barrier and make some effects. Like when you drink a cup of coffee, you might feel more alert. However, mercury can be detrimental to brain function. So please know that cerebral spinal fluid is the fluid around the brain and the spinal cord, and the blood-brain barrier is a protective barrier that prevents unwanted substances from entering the cerebral spinal fluid and into the brain. So key concepts. The central nervous system of vertebrates consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system includes many pairs of nerves that connect the brain and spinal cord to the rest of the body, and I expect you to know the different types of peripheral nerves. Now let's talk about the human brain. The human brain is made up of multiple parts, and we're going to talk about some key parts here. The portion of the hindbrain just above the spinal cord is called the medulla oblongata, and it's shown here in this red circle. This part of your brain is really important because it controls heartbeat strength, breathing, reflexes such as swallowing, coughing, vomiting, and sneezing. So the medulla oblongata is the hindbrain region that controls breathing, rhythm, and reflexes such as coughing and vomiting. So if I ask you on your exam, what part of your brain is important for coughing and vomiting, you should tell me the medulla oblongata. Sometimes I remember what the medulla oblongata does when I think about Happy Gilmore. The next part of the brain is called the pons. And the pons means bridge. It basically extends the pons in the midbrain. So it's connecting the midbrain to the rest of the brain. And it's really important in the control of breathing. So if I ask you what part of the brain is extremely important for control of breathing, you should tell me the pons. The next is the cerebellum. That lies at the back of the brain. It's about the size of a plum, and it's shown here. It's densely packed with neurons, and it's really important for controlling your posture and also voluntary movements. So that's movements that you make in your body. Like you think about moving your hand, and you move your hand. The forebrain contains the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the human brain, which you can see right here. Each hemisphere has an outer layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for our unique capacities such as language and abstract thought that other organisms can't do. So the cerebrum is the forebrain region that controls higher functions. Most sensory signals destined for the cerebrum must pass through something called the thalamus, and here's where the thalamus is in the middle of the brain. And this sorts them and sends them to the proper region of the cerebral cortex. So they're kind of like, think of it as like a traffic cop who's conducting traffic. Your thalamus is what is going to be sorting all sorts of sensory information that your body is taking in. So the thalamus is the forebrain region that relays signals to the cerebrum. The hypothalamus, which is under the thalamus, is a center for homeostatic control of the internal environment. This is what is going to be controlling your body temperature, your hormones, anything that keeps your body running. So the hypothalamus is the forebrain region that controls processes related to homeostasis. It's the control center for the endocrine function. And remember, endocrine means hormone. So, the human cerebrum. Our capacity for voluntary action, language, and conscious thought arise from activity of the cerebral cortex. And the cortex interacts with other regions of the brain in shaping emotional responses and making memories. So, the cerebral cortex, which you guys can see here, it's the dark yellow, is a 2 millimeter thick, highly folded layer of gray matter in the outer layer of the cerebrum. Its prominent folds in the cortex define the cerebrum's frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. You guys don't need to know that part. Just know that the cerebral cortex is a 2 millimeter thick, highly folded layer of gray matter and is responsible for our very complex behavior. What's cool is that we've split this up into various functions. So the primary motor cortex near the rear of each frontal lobe controls skeletal muscles, and each hemisphere controls and receives signals from the opposite side of the body. So have you ever heard if you're left-brained or right-brained? So if you're left-handed, you're usually right-brained, and if you're right-handed, you're left-brained. There are very cool parts of the cerebral cortex. You have sensory areas of the cerebral cortex that allow us to perceive sensations. So if you look at this picture of the brain, you can see that this part of the brain is important for smell, for hearing, for auditory association area, for speech, taste, reading, visual association, and vision. So if you had an injury to the brain around the vision region of your cerebral cortex, and that's going to affect your ability to see. You also have something called the limbic system, and you can see the limbic system shown here. And this is the emotional part of the brain. This is what governs your emotions and assists in memories and correlates organ activities with self-gratifying behavior, such as eating or sex. So if you've ever eaten like the most delicious piece of chocolate cake in your life and you're like, oh my God, this is so pleasurable, that would be your limbic system firing off. Or if you have sex and you have an orgasm and you get that pleasure, it's going to be firing off in your limbic system. So limbic system is a group of brain structures that govern emotion. It encircles the upper brainstem and includes the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the adjacent structures. What you need to know about the limbic system is that this is the part of your brain that governs your emotions. Making memories. Memories form in stages. You have short-term memories and you have long-term memories. The short-term memory holds a few bits of information, maybe numbers, words, or a sentence for a few seconds or an hour. Maybe you have to remember to make flashcards tonight. A long-term memory stores larger chunks of information more or less permanently. What's interesting, and this might help you guys with your studying when you're trying to remember stuff, is that emotions influence memory retention. So if you associate an event with something really happy or something really sad or makes you really angry, you're more likely to remember it than if you don't have an association to a feeling. So try to be positive while you're studying for biology and maybe get a little bit excited and maybe you'll remember the stuff a little bit better. Different types of memories are stored and brought to mind by different mechanisms. You have two different types of memories. You have skill memories, that's repetition of motor tasks. That would be like learning how to walk, eating, learning how to swim. You say like you never forget how to ride a bicycle. That would be a skill memory. A declarative memory is facts and impressions, and that involves the temporal lobe. So that would be remembering your birth date, your phone number, a birthday that you had, a funeral. That would be a declarative memory. So the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that evolved most recently. In humans, it governs conscious behavior and interacts with the limbic system in forming and retrieving memories. So if we go back to the whole thing with ecstasy at the very beginning, the active ingredient in ecstasy, or MDMA, hardens the brain's inner neurons that produce a neurotransmitter serotonin. And I had told you guys that a little bit before. And so if you're not making as much serotonin, you're not going to feel as good if you're not taking the drug. And unfortunately, neurons do not divide, so damaged ones are not replaced. And so folks who take MDMA, or ecstasy, or mollies, what happens is they become very, very depressed because those neurons are now messed up. These are all your key terms for this chapter. And if you do choose to make a study guide, this is how you should make your study guides. You should be able to tell me, how do cells communicate with each other? What are the 3 types of neurons? Can you describe the nervous system in invertebrates? How is the nervous system organized in vertebrates? Can you describe the 3 parts of the neurons? Can you explain the effects of drugs and various disorders on the nervous system? So how do stimulants and depressants affect the nervous system? And what occurs to the brain/nervous system during ADHD, Alzheimer's, and mood disorders? Can you explain the structure and function of the peripheral nervous system? Can you differentiate between somatic and autonomic nerves? Can you compare the action of parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons? You should also tell me what the central nervous system consists of, be able to describe the structure and function of the brain and spinal cord, how do reflexes occur, what are the effects of injuries to the spinal cord, and you should be able to describe the location and function of different parts of the brain. I'm not going to ask you on your exam for the location of different parts of the brain, but I will be asking you about their function. You should also know the different functions of the cerebral cortex and how different types of memories are made.